Good morning, everyone. My name is Rima Izquierdo, and we'll get started in just a few minutes while we give people a moment to get situated. So if you need to get anything, please do so now. We'll start in just a couple of minutes. I also want to be sure to announce that this presentation is available with automatic closed captioning. Hoy y siempre brindamos servicios de interpretación simultánea para nuestros eventos, igual en persona o en Zoom. Favor de hacer clic en el globo al fondo de su pantalla donde dice interpretación. Luego, haga el clic en el idioma que desea escuchar, en este caso español. Si quiere escuchar solo al intérprete, puede también hacer clic en el Mute Original Audio, que silenciará el audio original. Muchísimas gracias y de nuevo bienvenidos a Sinergia. Estamos agradecidos en tenerlos aquí. Before we begin, I wanted to let everyone know that we are broadcasting today's event live via our Facebook page and want to give a warm welcome to those joining us there. A few housekeeping notes. Everyone who registered via Zoom will receive a copy of the presentation slides via a follow-up email within the next few days. A survey will be shared via link at the end of this presentation. We will have time at the end of the presentation for a question and answer session, and we encourage questions at any time. However, please remember this is a public forum and we are being broadcast on Facebook. My name is Rima Izquierdo, and I am the trainer here at Synergia's Metropolitan Parent Center. A few words about Synergia's Autism Initiative. The Autism Initiative project is funded by a grant from the New York City Council under its Autism Initiative. This project supplements the work of Synergia's Metropolitan Parent Center by bringing increased awareness to New York City residents, particularly to the communities with large Spanish-speaking populations, about the growing number of children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Its strong outreach component targets families of children with a suspected or known diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder who are not receiving appropriate educational services, health, or other related services. The initiative will link them to other services and supports that meet the individual needs of children and their families. I want to thank you all for joining us. We are glad you chose to be with us today. Before we get to it, I would like to introduce our presenter today. Let's give a warm welcome to Ross Baker, School Discipline and Special Education Advocate from Advocates for Children. So glad you could join us today. We have so many questions, so I'll let you get to it. For those of you joining us, after the presenter concludes their presentation, we will have a question and answer session. If you're joining us on Facebook and you have questions, please place them in the comments section. Thank you.
Okay, so you want me to give folks a few more minutes till 10:35 maybe, and then we'll go forward?
Sure, we can give people a minute, of course.
Okay. All right, so I'll wait another minute or so, and then I'll get started.
And maybe you can just introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about the work you do at AFC.
Sure. So, like Rima said, my name is Ross Baker. I'm a school discipline and special education advocate with Advocates for Children. We are also a parent center, so we work in partnership with Synergia a lot. But we also have the School Justice Project, which I'm on, where we represent students in suspension hearings, work with court-involved youth, and advocate for more progressive discipline in New York City schools. And I'll speak a little bit more about that later, so you'll have a little bit of a better sense of what that means. So thank you to Synergia for hosting. It's always really fun to work alongside you all. So I'll get started. So here's a little bit of an overview of today's training. So I'm going to do an introduction on the topic, so school discipline and then behavioral supports. Um, we're going to talk about the types of suspensions and parents' rights in the suspension process, then some legal protections for students with disabilities, and then some key takeaways. Um, and I know that today we'll be monitoring the Q&A, and we'll have time for a Q&A after. So if you have questions, please feel free to share them. Um, I'll also include some of AFC's contact information at the end. I guess when I was introducing myself, I also should have mentioned that we do workshops and webinars as well. So you can come to our website if you have any questions or want to get in touch with us or have follow-ups after the presentation. So briefly, I'm going to talk about some school-based supports that are offered. Um, so there's at-risk counseling, formal behavior interventions, crisis de-escalation plans, SDH community coordinators, um, and then school-based mental health services. So this is kind of a continuum of services that schools offer. At-risk counseling is typically for students who are in crisis or are in an extended period of crisis. And this is usually somewhat time sensitive and offered by most schools. Informal behavior interventions are positive behavior interventions in the classroom or sort of plans that the schools, students, and families can come up with collaboratively for some supports and strategies to just help students stay focused and stay on task. A crisis de-escalation plan is typically a plan where the school and a family and the student come together to decide how to support a student if for some reason they're in crisis in school. So this can be designating a safe space for them, designating trusted adults in the building, and then the last two, um, they vary to an extent for what most schools offer, but some schools have community coordinators who work with partners in partnership with organizations in the community to provide wraparound support. And then some schools offer school-based mental health services where students can receive more long-term counseling. Um, like Rima said, this presentation can be sent out afterwards. So if you want to see a list of what's offered, you can use this hyperlink here. It varies by school and district, but it's a somewhat interactive tool to see what your district or school offers. So some examples of the support services here. I already spoke to a few of them, but here's a little bit more of a detailed list. So some schools have school response teams, some have school mental health specialists, um, some have school mental health prevention and intervention program. There are a few partnerships between health and hospitals and the schools where they provide community-based support and mental health services connected with a hospital. Um, and then there's also school-based health centers, mental health clinics, um, and then also some schools have a central crisis response team. So again, it varies by district, but these are some of the resources that are available in the Department of Education, New York City Public Schools. Not certain what branding they're going with right now, but um, yeah, I guess I should just say as a note, I'll use Department of Education, DOE, or New York City Public Schools interchangeably. I tend to work with DOE, so, or that's just what I'm familiar with. So if I say that, just know that it means the same thing. So this is a little bit of like an interactive tool to search what supports your school has. So each school that has a DOE website that lists the specific mental health supports, you can go to schoolsearch.schools.nyc, type in the name or address of the school, and then you should be able to see what supports they have here through the mental health and wellness tab. So this slide itself isn't interactive, but using the school search educative.schools.nyc, you can see what schools, what your child's school has, and what type of supports they offer. And then if you see something you're not sure, you can go back to the link that I shared before. That will have a little bit more information on the different types of programs. Um, so, for example, here, you could see that, there's a school-based mental health clinic. Um, there's a New York City Mental Health for All hub. Um, and if you have any questions, the parent coordinator or school social worker should be able to support you and give you more information about what type of supports that are available at the school. Okay, so I mentioned this at the very beginning, so maybe when some folks are still getting in, but this is just an overview of what we do at Advocates for Children on our school justice project. So, like I mentioned before, I work in the Parent Center at AFC alongside organizations like Synergia, but I also work for our school justice project. And this is just a little overview of what our project works on. So we help young people who are facing criminal justice involvement or court involvement, students who are dealing with school suspensions, students who are excluded from school due to their behavior, students who are either facing or I guess, committing bullying behavior. Um, and our goals are really to advocate for alternatives to discipline and for behavior supports and services so students remain in school. Um, and then we do this through intervention, working directly with families, but then also we participate in city and statewide coalitions to reform school discipline policies and procedures. And we advocate for investments and supports for students. So um, as a project, we work directly with families in helping them feel like their schools are more inclusive for their students and keeping students in school. And then also we do broader policy work to ensure that we are cuando hay cursos en español. Oh, there is hay una traducción de español. Rima, do
Yo
you want?
puedo, yep, I got it. So podemos conectar con la interpretación. En abajo de su pantalla hay un globo al fondo y cuando hace el clic ahí, puede, puede coger, luego clic en el idioma que desea escuchar, se puede poner español y va a cambiar el canal al intérprete. Pero puede poner su pantalla donde dice el globo al bajo y va a conectar. Y si no conecta, okay, and we also have the captions on. Um, so I'm gonna leave the captions in English, pero puede conectar con el español cuando hace el clic en el idioma que quieres. Pero también los direcciones está en el charla, so puede buscar el charla y también puede ver las direcciones para español ahí. And I'll answer them in the Q&A directly, and I'll put them there so you can keep going, Ross. Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Um, okay, and also, y también vamos a mandar la presentación en los dos idiomas después de la presentación. So we're gonna, I know Synergia will send out copies of the presentation in English and Spanish after the presentation is done. So in a few days. So for the links and things in the presentation, whether you're uh, listening or following along in English or in Spanish, you should get a copy of the presentation in your preferred or in both of those languages in a few days once Synergia sends everything out. Okay, so to move on, we're going to talk a little bit now about suspensions. So just generally, some trends that we see locally and nationally with students who are suspended. Students who are suspended are more likely to miss class, be held back a grade, be suspended again, drop out, or get arrested. So that's not to say that um, a suspension necessarily guarantees that, one of these things is going to happen to your child. But we share this just to show that, being suspended and missing school or missing regular class time uh, can tend to have further effects down the line. So one thing is why we and a lot of others really advocate for alternative approaches to discipline so students are still staying in their mainstream environment. So this is some data from the 2021-2022 school year. So right now it's a little bit outdated, but we will be updating it soon. But this is 1 year after the return to school from remote learning. So the DOE issued over 25,000 suspensions and over 6,600 classroom removals. 40% of all suspensions went to students with disabilities, who only comprise 21% of DOE enrollment. So students with disabilities are being disproportionately suspended in relation to how much they actually make up the population. And then Black students received over half of all superintendent suspensions, despite making up only 21% of DOE enrollment. So this, unfortunately, is a trend that we've seen for a long time. And I think it actually had lessened before the pandemic. But it kind of seems like since students have returned, some of these disparities are coming back in a little bit a higher number. So it's just really important as we work with community members just to remember and be mindful of um, how people we're in community with are being disproportionately impacted by school suspensions. And again, this is central to why we really advocate for alternate approaches to school discipline. So um, this is typically something we do, I think, when I'm doing a training in person. Um, but for the sake of time, I'll just go through these. And if you're following along, you can try to answer, and um, I'll give explanations for each true or false question. Um, just because this is a webinar format, um, I think I'll just go through them a little bit. And if you have questions, again, you can feel free to ask. So the school can call you to come pick up your child early. This is actually false. So often in person and in workshops that we do, um, we'll have parents say, well, this can't be true, or this is definitely true because this happens to me all the time. Um, where a teacher or someone will call a student or call a family to pick up their child. While this does happen, it's technically not a formal type of classroom removal that is allowed. Um, I'm going to talk about those shortly, but um, the school should not just be calling a parent saying, hey, you got to come get your child. They're acting out. Um, and in a little bit, I'll talk about some of the DOE policies and legal protections around that. Your child needs a doctor's approval to come back after suspension or after removal. I'll give a few seconds so you can think about it. Maybe talk to your screen or talk to folks who are watching. So this is also false. There's no need for a doctor's approval to come back to a school. This is not part of any type of formal removal or suspension. Um, After suspension, you have to meet with the principal before your child can come back to school. So again, I'll stall a little bit, give folks a moment to think. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to go through these a little bit more quickly. So this one is also false. It kind of depends on what you want to do as a parent, but this is by no means a requirement for coming back to school. I'll talk a little bit later about welcome back circles, which is part of the New York City Discipline Code. which is an option for students who get suspended to reintegrate them into their school community. But it is not a requirement that the parent or student have a formal meeting with the principal before coming back to school. So the principal can call EMS if they think your child is a danger to themselves and others. Um, okay, so this one gets a big blue question mark because um, the answer is yes and no. So the principal, this is also something that happens quite often. Um, but the reason why there's a question mark here is because the principal and school have to prove that there is a substantial risk of danger to a student or to other students in the school. Um, Again, this can be a little bit tricky because it's often a judgment call. Um, but it is important to know that schools, this is a very last resort, and this isn't something that schools should be doing unless there's a really imminent threat or serious danger. And then lastly, a student can be suspended for a year. So this actually is true. There are many protections for students not to be suspended for a year. And I'll go through those a little later. But a student, technically the DOE can suspend a student for a year. Um, but throughout this process and with the protections that I'll mention shortly, there also has to be uh, reconvenings of meetings with the Office of Safety and Youth Development and the family to uphold the suspension. So thank you for participating in whatever capacity you're able. My apologies for this portion not being as interactive. Um, but yeah, I hope it was a little bit helpful. But again, as we go through the presentation, I'll kind of dive into some more of these things. So they're a little bit more clear. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the types of suspensions and removals in New York City. And here we have Bart writing about the three types. So there's a teacher's removal, principal suspension, and superintendent. So all of the types of removals I'm going to talk about, along with the supports, come from this one, or I guess these two documents. So um, this is the New York City DOE discipline code. As you'll see, there's a different set of expectations for students from kindergarten to fifth grade and students from 6th to 12th grade. There's a little bit less language about suspensions and like formal exclusion for younger students, um, whereas there's a more extensive like specific discipline code for students from in grades 6 to 12. But this is a really important document. Schools should provide it to families at the beginning of the year. If you don't have it, you can search New York City School Discipline Code, and they have them available in many languages on their website. So um, this is an example from the grades 6 to 12 discipline code of what you might find. So I want to mention also that there's a lot of information here about progressive disciplining and steps that schools can take to support students and ensure that they're feeling safe and also that they're not being disciplined too harshly in the classroom, and that schools aren't immediately resorting to suspension. So so in addition to having like infractions like I'm about to discuss, this also has what the schools must do to serve students and protect students, and what schools should try to implement before jumping straight to an exclusionary punishment like a suspension. So these are levels of infractions. These are codes that the school uses in the system they use to track any behavioral issues. But this is an example here. And you'll see for each level of infraction, there's a type of suggested disciplinary response or available disciplinary response that the school has. Um, so this will be like the second half of the page. So in response to one of the intervention or one of the infractions from the previous page, for example, you can see here that there's two sections. There's supports and interventions, and then a range of possible disciplinary responses. Um, so um, schools are typically supposed to follow the supports and interventions. As problems come up or behavioral issues arise. So I'll talk about a few of them more specifically going forward, but as you can see, there's an extensive list of what's available to families and students as far as supports and interventions are concerned. So behavioral progress, conflict resolution, mediation. Um, and then on the right side, you can see that there's a little bit more of a range of what the possible disciplinary responses are. So, for example, for the level 4 infractions, the superintendent suspension can be given for up to 16 to 20 days. And I'll talk a little bit more about what this all means. But basically, we highlight this part to show that there is a very wide range of disciplinary responses. And it's your right as a parent or as an advocate to ask that the school consider supports and interventions um, or somewhere on the range of these disciplinary responses, given that these are all resources available to DOE schools. Okay, so um, here we have the types of removal or suspensions. So there's three types, um, and these kind of go to the questions or the true or false exercise that I was doing before. So there's a teacher's removal, a principal suspension, and a superintendent suspension. Um, so a teacher's removal is the most sort of like the shortest range of a classroom removal. So it can be up to 4 days. The parent has a right to ask for a meeting, and there must be a phone call home with a teacher's removal. So this also is specific only to whatever classroom that the teacher is instructing in. So this is not a full day suspension. This is just removal from one specific class or one class period. So this shouldn't be a teacher, like I mentioned before, this shouldn't be a teacher calling families or calling parents saying, hey, can you pick your student up? This is more saying, hey, the student needs to be removed from the class for this day or for these few days. And usually they'll be in a different on-site location. But in this case, parents absolutely have the right to ask for a meeting and ask what's going on, why the student's been removed. A principal suspension, so this can be up to 5 days. The principal will hold a conference with the family regarding the incident, where the family will have the opportunity to learn about what happened, question the principal's investigation, and this should come with a written notice within 24 hours. These suspensions may be served at an alternate learning site, which I'll talk about in a little bit, or in a non-classroom site at the school. So in the principal's office. So while there's technically nothing called like an in-school suspension, I use this term a lot, this might be what people are referring to, where a student is out of the classroom for a few days in the principal's office. And then the most severe or strongest form of discipline that the New York City DOE has is a superintendent suspension. So this can last from 6 to 20 days. It requires a formal hearing at a borough suspension office. Again, families are required 24-hour written notice in their preferred language. And then these suspensions can last for more than 20 days for some level 5 infractions only. And level 5 infractions are outlined in the discipline code that I shared before. and no other types of removals are allowed. So, you shouldn't be getting a call from a teacher saying, "Hey, can you pick your student up? I can't deal with this today." Um, there are formal processes that the DOE has to follow, and they're outlined in the discipline code, and the DOE is aware of them. Okay, so students can only be expelled if they're over 17 and they don't have an IEP. So if a student is under 17, the student cannot be expelled from New York City DOE. And if a student has an IEP, they can't be expelled at any point. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about protections for students with disabilities a bit later. So no corporal punishment is allowed in the New York State Department of Education. So this means that school administrators cannot inflict any bodily harm on students. So no hitting, no really touching students in any manner as a form of punishment, no even some types of really loud verbal punishment could constitute corporal punishment, but this is absolutely illegal in the New York City Department of Education. And then another is schools cannot transfer students without permission. So unfortunately, this is something that we see occasionally where a school will say to a parent, "Hey, we're suspending your student. We don't want to deal with them. Um, you have to transfer them to another school. They can't come back here." The parent always has a right to decide whether a student transfers or not. The school cannot force a transfer. The one thing that I will say as a caveat to this is that this presentation is just focusing on New York City DOE schools. This does not unfortunately apply to charter schools. Charter schools have their own discipline code that can differ from the New York City DOE discipline code. So if your student's at a charter school, 100% you should request a copy of their discipline code to see what your student's rights are. So for a principal suspension, like I mentioned before, a written notice is required in the parent's language. So this should have the reason for the suspension, the date, time, and place of the suspension conference, period of removal and alternate instruction. So basically where the student needs to go during the suspension, and a statement of students' rights. And again, this must be delivered to a parent within 24 hours, whether it's by mail, in-person delivery, or via student. So for a principal suspension, students must stay in class until the suspension conference, except if that threat of danger, like I mentioned before, and the school deems that there is a sufficient threat of danger. I think as a parent, it's important to understand that you have the right to ask the school to define what that is, because sometimes schools will just say that, and it won't necessarily make sense. So I always think it's worth questioning schools to see, how they're defining that. So at the principal suspension conference, the principal must attend the conference and decide if the suspension is justified. The parent has a right to present the student's version and question witnesses. Parents have a right to an interpreter provided by the DOE, and the parents have a right to discuss a plan to address the behavior. So for a superintendent suspension, the schools must get approval from the DOE Office of Safety and Youth Development and their district superintendent to go forward with a superintendent suspension. So a parent must get a written notice within 24 hours, including the reason for the suspension, the alternate school location, details about the hearing, witness list, and a parent's rights and places to call for help. So this is a sample of a notice of superintendent suspension. Just to note, this document looks pretty much the same regardless of the suspension. There's just a few things that change. So change for each suspension. So it should be addressed to the parent at their home address. You'll see that there's information about when the suspension starts towards the top of the page. And then also during the suspension where your child is supposed to report for alternative learning. So it's important to know that a student is not supposed to be removed from education even during a suspension. So anytime a student is suspended, they're given an alternative instruction site. So for principal suspension, oftentimes this is the principal's office. But for longer term suspensions, this is an alternative learning center. So sort of a different school that a student is expected to attend during their suspension. And it's really important that either uh, students attend this site, or if for some reason it's too far from where the family lives, or it's difficult to uh, get to, then the family should call the suspension site and let them know if there are any issues, because attendance is tracked here. So if a student is serving a longer suspension and they don't show up, um, it's functionally the same as missing a lot of school unexcused, which could result in an ACS call or any other type of action by the DOE. And then at the bottom, you'll see that there's a suspension hearing portion. So this tells you when the suspension hearing will be, where it will be, um, and who to contact for the suspension hearing. So um, each borough has a suspension hearing office, um, with the exception of Staten Island. The Staten Island suspension hearing office is in South Brooklyn. So Brooklyn has two suspension offices, one on Adams Street and then one down, I think, on Ocean Avenue, um, further down towards Midwood. And that's for Staten Island and Southern Brooklyn. So then the second page of this document is the suspension charge. So what the school is saying that the charge is. So in this example, on April 17th, 2018, at approximately 2 p.m., Sam student engaged in physically aggressive behavior as he swung his fist at Tina teacher. So these are usually pretty short sentences. This isn't meant to give a long description or the school's account of what happened, just to say what the charge is that your student's being suspended for. And then there's always this language here that says the behavior constitutes a danger to the health, safety, welfare, and morals of your child and others at the school. I only mention this because I've had families say, what does this mean? How is my child threatening the morals of the school? And I agree, it's sort of weird or confusing language, but it is something that's just included in these notices. So it's not specific to uh, your child or like a judgment that the school is making in the specific circumstance. So also included here is a non-binding witness list. So any witnesses that could be present at the suspension hearing. So the next part of a superintendent suspension is the suspension packet. This is different than the suspension notice. So the school must provide it to you before the hearing, and we always advocate for parents to ask for the packet as soon as possible, because this is basically the information that you're operating from when you go to the hearing. So included in this should be an occurrence report. So some form of how the school entered the incident into their internal reporting system, witness statements, including from students. So if any other students, staff members, or bystanders saw the incident and the school took witness statements from them, a records cover sheet, any video if necessary, any injury reports, any other types of evidence or other school records. So this is really important to have to go to the hearing, because this is essentially how the school proves, or the information the school is allowed to use to prove what they're alleging that your child did. And it's also important to know that students have the right to not write a witness statement, even if they're asked. They can say that they refuse to. So if a school is investigating an issue and they ask for a witness statement, students are not entitled to write one. So this is just an example of the records cover sheet. It'll have students' demographic information, their grade, whether they're a general ed student or, not, or a student with an IEP, their attendance record, any previous suspensions, and an academic record. Yeah, and you can see the suspension history highlighted. So these are some of the charges, that the student might have had in the past. And these come from the discipline code. This is the second half of the document. Um, there's a portion with a synopsis of a disciplinary record, um, prior guidance, interventions, and recommendations. I always think this is an important part for parents and folks to look at because, like I said before, per the discipline code, the DOE is supposed to engage in progressive discipline or progressive intervention. So for any incident, it's DOE policy for schools to kind of escalate the disciplinary response. So there should be some form of intervention before suspension. So whether it's counseling, mediation, um, some sort of behavioral support, it's important to see what the school writes here and to determine if any of those things have happened. Because it's always important to remind the school, the DOE, suspension hearing office, that the school has the responsibility to try other methods of discipline before resorting to suspension. Um, and then at the bottom, you see the principal's recommendation for how long the suspension will be. So this one says 10 days. This can vary from incident to incident, school to school. Um, This is an example of a witness statement. So doesn't have too much information. It just has the person's name, their role, and then an accounting of what happened. These statements should be collected in the presence of whoever in the school is investigating the incident. This is the ORS report. So this is the occurrence report and how this is entered into the Department of Education's central behavior reporting system. So this isn't evidence necessarily. It's not like a witness statement or an ironclad recounting of what happened. It's just how the incident was reported into the Department of Education's reporting system. So like I mentioned before, for a suspension, a superintendent suspension, families have the right to a suspension hearing at one of the central borough hearing offices. And at this hearing, families have three options. So an adjournment for good cause, a plea of no contest, or proceeding with a hearing. So an adjournment for good cause is basically an opportunity um, to wait to have the hearing. Um, but usually this is done because the family's finding representation for the hearing. So whether that's an advocate, a lawyer, or a representative to represent them in the hearing, if the family's trying to collect evidence, um, or other reason, it's important to know that during an adjournment for good cause, the student will remain out of school until the suspension hearing, unless the adjournment is called by the school, which can happen if the school shows up and they realize that they need a witness. They might say, oh, we need to reschedule this. In that case, then the student should return to their home school until the hearing. Families can enter a plea of no contest. So this isn't admitting to the charge or agreeing with it or disagreeing with it. This is just saying that the student the family will accept the charge as written, and the suspension office will decide how long the suspension lasts. So this can be a helpful option if, maybe the charge isn't so serious, but the actual evidence is a lot more serious. So once it gets to a hearing office, the office, the suspension hearing office makes a decision about how long a suspension will be. So in an incident where um, the evidence could be really bad or really damaging, but the charge is not reflective of that evidence, it might be a good idea to plead a no contest. And then the third option is to proceed with the hearing. Um, and this is something that where families can represent themselves, um, or they can get an advocate or a lawyer to represent them in the hearing. So within 2 days of a hearing, the hearing officer makes recommendation based on testimony and all documents and evidence. So parents must receive notification within 2 days whether charges are dismissed or sustained. If the charges are sustained, where the student will be assigned to attend the school. So this is typically the alternate learning center. And then how the suspension will be reflected in students' records, including when they'll be expunged. So when they'll be removed from their record. Within 5 days of hearing, the hearing officer must mail a full report of findings and disposition to the parent. So this will be a report of what happened in the hearing, what evidence was presented, if the hearing office found the evidence to be credible, that sort of thing. And students remain at the alternative education site pending the decision unless the parties agree otherwise. So unless, for some reason the school and the hearing office say, well, they can return to school until we get the decision. So if the charges are sustained, the superintendent may immediately reinstate the student to school, continue the suspension, um, and then for very serious behavior, continue the suspension for more than 20 school days up to a year, which triggers an automatic renewal for 40 or more school days, um, or expulsion. But again, like I mentioned, there's those protections for students who turn 17 or students under 17 and students with an IEP. And then also the superintendent can recommend services, grant or deny a school transfer. So not force a school transfer, but if a parent, wants their student to be in a new environment, the superintendent can get involved in that process. Um, it's also important to note that the period before the hearing where the student's at an alternative learning center, those suspension days count as suspension days. So it's not like the suspension starts only after the hearing. So it's important to keep a good record of when the student was removed from school. So once the hearing happens, you can tell the hearing office how many days the student has already been out of school, because those will be factored into the length of the superintendent's suspension. So um, you have the opportunity to appeal any suspension decision. So you can first file an appeal to the Chancellor's Office of Legal Services, must file within 20 school days of the date of the decision or 10 school days from the receipt of a tape recording or hearing transcript. So you have the right to request the hearing transcript from the hearing office. Um, and that kind of sets the clock for when you can start the appeal. If you're unsatisfied with the appeal at the chancellor's level or the Office of Legal Service, you can appeal to the New York State Education Commissioner. But that has to happen within 30 days of the first appeal decision. Um, all right. This is just a built-in time for Q&A. I know we're going to have a little bit more time at the end. Again, this is sometimes something we use for our in-person presentations, but there's a little bit more information following this. But I'll just pause for a sec. I just need to drink a little water. So I'll just pause for a moment and then we'll continue.
And I got you, Russ. So I'll facilitate questions. So I don't see any in this Q&A here. Doris, do you see any questions on Facebook?
No, currently there's no questions on Facebook.
Okay, wonderful. So again, participants, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A if you're on our Zoom. And if you're in Facebook, if you can go into the comments and we'll read your questions out loud so that we can get them answered for you. Thank you.
Yep, and just even though this is just a pause for a Q&A and we have one later, like Rima said, at any point, if anything comes up, please just jump in. All right, so I've talked a little bit about the Alternative Learning Center. While a student is at the Alternative Learning Center, they should be getting the same type of instruction they would be getting at school. So this includes homework, classwork, exams, and full-time instruction for younger students. Only 2 hours of instruction are needed throughout the day for high school students, but they still should be getting their full workload. So even if they're only spending 2 hours at the alternative learning site, they should be getting the full workload of exams, classwork, homework. And if there are regents or state exams during the suspension, the student should be taking those. So a suspension should not cause a student to miss any type of regent or state exam. So during a principal suspension or while waiting for a suspension hearing, like I said before, students from kindergarten to 8th grade should be receiving a full day's worth of instruction. And then high schoolers should be receiving at least 2 hours a day of instruction in person. And then all students who continue to be suspended have a right to full instruction. All right, so we're gonna shift gears a little bit now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about protections for students with disabilities in the event of any, disciplinary response, intervention. Um, so I will continue with that. I see there's a question in the Q&A, but I guess um, should I address it now or towards the end, Rima?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a good time for it now, because I don't want to transition too far away from the
Sure.
topic.
Yeah, I would say so. The question is it common practice for a kindergartner with an IEP in a CIT class to get, or an ICT class, I assume, to get parents to call almost daily to get picked up and forced to enroll in District 75? Um, it should not be. No, there should parents should not be getting a call to pick up a student um, daily. Um, and the school cannot force you into a placement. There have to be evaluations done. And we're going to talk a little bit about that right now, actually. But I would certainly recommend that you reach out to us at AFC or Synergia, because this is definitely something that we support families with. Because schools shouldn't be forcing you to change a placement, and they definitely should not be forcing you to pick up a student, especially, I mean, especially in kindergarten. It's really young. Um,
And
or
I'd like to add too, um, least restrictive environment. If the student can academically keep up in the setting that they're currently in, then that is the most appropriate setting. They just need to implement behavioral supports, and that may look like, we're going to discuss it right now, is the FBA and the BIP, which is, the functional behavior assessment and the behavior intervention plan. So I think that's like an awesome segue into this slide. But just remember that if your student academically can keep up in whatever setting they're in, that is the most appropriate setting. Setting is not based on behavior.
yeah, yeah, that's such a helpful interjection, and you're right. Great segue. So, yeah, this we do another workshop on IEPs and special ed, and briefly, I'll just say, like Rima mentioned, uh, students have the right to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So exactly as Rima said, they can keep up with the work. That's the least restrictive environment, and it should be as close to a mainstream population as possible. So protections for students with disabilities, that is a really helpful segue. Um, I guess just generally there are expedited evaluations, an MDR, suspension plan, FBA and BIP. It's a lot of information, but I'll go through each of them shortly. So just on this slide, don't feel like you have to memorize everything right here. So who is a student with a disability for discipline purposes? Students with IEPs, students with 504 plans, and if the school is deemed to know. So a school is deemed to know if a student has uh, a disability or is suspected of having a disability. Um, this is something called child find, where schools are required to evaluate or investigate any suspected disability. If a teacher is noticing something, a parent's noticing something, this is really important. And I'll speak a little bit more to this later. But these are students who are considered as having a disability for discipline purposes. So in the event of a disciplinary event where the student is suspected of potentially having a disability, parents have a right to an expedited evaluation. A school is deemed to know, again, if a student may have a disability. So if they're exhibiting behavior consistent with a certain disability, the school should be investigating that and thinking about evaluating the student. So in this case, an expedited evaluation must happen within 15 days of parental consent. And of course, as a parent, you always have the right to consent or not consent to any school evaluation. So an MDR is a meeting that also happens as a result of a suspension, typically longer than 5 days, or a suspension. There's different rules for when an MDR is triggered, but if it's a long-term suspension, if there's a bunch of suspensions that happen, within a short period of time, so like within a few months, if your student's suspended over and over again and has a disability, then an MDR should be triggered. So an MDR is a manifestation determination review. And it's basically a meeting to decide if the student's behavior is caused by the student's disability or a result of the school's failure to follow the student's IEP or BIP. So this happens after suspension hearing. So it's a different process, and this is done with the school. And I'll include shortly who's going to be part of this meeting. But it's important to know that this is a two-pronged thing. So whether the behavior that the student is being disciplined for is consistent with behavior associated with their disability, or if a school has an IEP or behavior intervention plan with information about how to support the student and they're not doing those things. So, for example, if a student is supposed to have a behavioral para with them in class, and then they get in trouble for uh, running around or doing something disruptive in class, well, you could have an MDR and you would say, well, was the para there that day? Did the school provide a para? And they might say no, and you'd say, okay, well, this is an IEP, which is a legal document saying that the student must have a para. So the incident would be a manifestation of their disability, and they would return to school without being suspended. So if it is a manifestation, students must return to school. Schools must do an FBA, which then creates a behavior intervention plan. And we have slides towards the end where I'm going to talk about these a little bit more because these are really important and these aren't just specific to suspensions. If it's not a manifestation, then the suspension continues as it was decided at the hearing office. The school must create a suspension plan, so how the student is going to receive all of their regular services during their suspension and all of their IEP-related supports, and then also consider doing a functional behavior assessment, behavior intervention plan. So even though it's not required, it's still something that can help in the future prevent any similar behaviors from occurring or help the student and the school be more equipped to deal with any behaviors that might occur. So this is what I spoke to before, but this is when an MDR must be triggered. So if a student is suspended for 11 or more days in a row within 40 school days, or if there's a pattern. So often for a long-term suspension, an MDR should be triggered immediately. Sometimes they're not, but as a parent, if you have a student with a disability and they get suspended, I would just ask if it's possible to have an MDR because I think it's a really helpful tool in addition to the suspension hearing to discuss the behavior and discuss any possible supports or alternatives going forward. So during the MDR, what must be reviewed? The student's most recent IEP, the functional behavior assessment and the BIP, if there is one, evaluations and teachers' observations, the occurrence report of what happened, records from the parent, and other information. So parents can bring whatever records they want to these meetings. If they're up to date outside evaluations, or like, for example, if a student is seeing a therapist outside of school, it's really helpful to bring notes or information from that person. If the parent could get that person to attend, that would be even better. But really, all documents related to the student's disability and the specific incident at hand must be reviewed during the MDR. So this is a worksheet that the DOE must follow during the MDR. You can just look up MDR worksheet. So you have a copy while you're doing an MDR, but there are prompts that basically ask questions related to whether it's a manifestation of a disability or not. And parents have the right to have the DOE share this worksheet with them. And it's important to remember this, especially now as a lot of MDRs and IEP meetings are conducted virtually. This should still be completed collaboratively between the school and the parent. So if you see the school writing it during a virtual MDR, you definitely have the opportunity to say, hey, can you share that with me? I want to see how this is being recorded. So preparing for an MDR, review all of the documents, really important. Review specific language in the documents, so make sure that they're describing behaviors on the IEP. Make sure student is getting all their services on their IEP. So this is really important, kind of with the example I mentioned before. If a student should be getting a service per their IEP, which is a legal document, make sure the student is receiving that service as it's stated. And make sure that, yeah, the school is providing it. Otherwise, it's very likely that an incident is a manifestation of a student's disability. And then ask outside providers to participate. This can be tricky. I know providers are really busy, but it can be a really helpful tool if there's someone who's done an evaluation, a therapist, a doctor who knows a student and can say, hey, this is a student's disability. These are behaviors that are typical of their disability. This is something they, can't control. It's really helpful to have experts in the room. So if at all possible, that's something that's really helpful. Even if you can get a provider to just write a note about their work with the student, the disability, the more information, the better. Okay. So to Rima's point earlier, we're going to talk a little bit about an FBA. And I'm sorry for all the acronyms. There's so many, but FBA is a functional behavior assessment. So it's kind of a process as the school investigates this. And this becomes part of a student's IEP once it's completed. So the first question is, what's the behavior that needs to change? So maybe it's, if Ross is sitting down for too long, or not even that yet. Let's say Ross is running around the class constantly and he'll get up and throw materials. So that's the behavior that needs to change. It's distracting and potentially dangerous. An assessment. When is this happening? Where? How often? For how long? So is Ross doing this every day? Is this happening every week? Does this happen when there's an extended period of quiet reading? And Ross is supposed to be sitting at his desk and just reading for a while without interaction with a teacher or peer or check-ins. Is this lasting for minutes on end, only a short period of time? And then what's the function is of this behavior? Is it because of, a disability where Ross has trouble sitting still, or is not understanding the concept? So it's really peeling back layer by layer what a behavior is, why it's occurring, when it's occurring, and what it kind of means. So an FBA is conducted over a few days. And like I mentioned with the MDR, it should include teachers' evaluations, any reports from the school, observations, but it basically should give us information about a behavior and all the factors that contribute to that behavior. So then using the FBA, the FBA is used to create a BIP. So a BIP is a behavior intervention plan. And like I said, it's a plan that is used to conduct or that is used to support a student with a given behavior. And it must include specific data from an FBA. So classroom observations, reports, interviews with the student or with teachers. Um, and basically a BIP, it ends up being an additional document that protects a student from further discipline. So it's really helpful because it basically gives schools and students and families a roadmap for how to address disability-related behavior. So to say like, if this disability is happening, this is how the school should be intervening. These are some supports we should be doing. These are check-ins. This is some like walking around time. And it can range from a lot of things. Again, similar to an IEP, it's individualized to a student and their disability. But it's a document that lays out steps. And since it's part of the IEP, it's a legal document that lays out steps for what the student has to do and what the school has to do to support the student with the behavior. So how does the school prevent the behavior from occurring? If it is occurring, how do they manage the behavior? And then how do they measure progress? And measuring progress is really important because the goal of a BIP is to help a student progress and to help a student progress towards having a least restrictive placement. So maybe not needing a BIP or needing less supports going forward. So there should be measurable items that the school can track to see how they're making progress. It shouldn't just be like, oh, Ross will get up less. Like, yeah, that's helpful, but it doesn't tell us, it won't tell us going forward if that's working because it's not giving us data on the frequency or the severity of the issue. So it's important to have the specific information. And again, it's a protection if the school wants to try to discipline a student or suspend them, then it's really helpful because then you can say, hey, let's look at the BIP. Is there information about this behavior that the school has already addressed? And is the school implementing the strategies that they discussed with the parent to support this behavior? Okay, so we're approaching the end now. So 5 school discipline takeaways, and I know this has been a lot of information. And again, you'll receive the slides. So if there was anything that you felt like went really fast or you want more information, you can take a look at the slides, and we also have some links to other resources. So schools should try to help students before suspending them. This is super important. I think it's always, it can be hard for schools because they're dealing with a lot of students, but we all want students to be in schools as much as possible and in their mainstream education environment. So schools should try to help students before suspending them. So whether that's through mediation, positive behavior intervention, meetings with the parent, it's really important. Any notice for a suspension, for a principal suspension or superintendent suspension must be in writing. For a principal suspension, ask for a principal suspension conference to make sure that one happens. If the student's given an in-school suspension or a principal suspension, this is your right as a parent. Always get the packet for a superintendent suspension. The school has to provide it to you. Get it as early as possible. It will give you time to prepare for a suspension hearing. And then no out-of-school suspensions. So even if a student is given a lengthy superintendent suspension, for example, the student should still be receiving their education at an alternative learning site. So a student's education should not be interrupted by any type of suspension, even if it's for a serious infraction. The goal of a suspension is not for a student's learning to be interfered. So this is some information about us at AFC. at Advocates for Children. So if you have questions about the presentation, if you need help with a specific situation, please reach out to our helpline or our info email. We work with families, that's what we do. Our helpline are experts, and then if an issue is kind of complex, they can escalate you to an advocate or an attorney who can help you out. And then lastly, I know Synergia has sent out some surveys, and I know you'll probably receive a lot of surveys related to this presentation. This is just an internal one we do at AFC, so I'll leave this up here for a minute. If you could scan the QR code to complete the survey. I think you should be able to do it in English or Spanish. It just helps us going forward to know what to improve on, how you understood the information, and how we can best serve the community going forward. So I'll leave this up for a few more minutes as we go through the Q&A.
And I want to thank everybody for indulging us for completing 2 surveys. But this is how we are able to continue to provide high quality free workshops to the community by knowing how we're doing, what you want to know about, and how easily we're able to teach it to you. So we appreciate your time. And I have dropped our pre-registration questions in the chat, so we can start there. The first one is, how can you address the concern about soft suspension? How can I tell that my child's behavior is being addressed accordingly? Who has access to the BIP, the BIP, the Behavior Intervention Plan, and how often may that be implemented? What is the best way to address your child's discipline at school?
Okay, so that's a lot of questions. I got to be honest, I'm not sure the what what a soft suspension is. Maybe an in-school suspension. But I can speak to the other questions, which I hope might be able to uh, answer that question. So
And if that person's here, feel free to clarify in the Q&A what you mean by soft suspension.
okay. So a BIP can be looked at by the school's special education team, school administrators, and parents, and then teachers if they're included in the BIP. So if there are classroom interventions in the BIP, the teacher should have access. A BIP should be reviewed quarterly. It can be reviewed more frequently than that. But again, it's a really helpful tool to address a child's discipline at school. And that's kind of why I stress the importance of there being measurable progress in the BIP, because it's a living document, right? It's like the IEP. It's not like because I get a BIP, when I'm 6 years old, that my BIP is then going to stay the same. Even for that year, it should change as my needs adjust and my needs grow. So it's important that you're reviewing it frequently, usually once a quarter, to say like, hey, how's this going? Are the steps that we have for the intervention being followed? Is, if a teacher's supposed to be offering a reward or something, or if there's supposed to be a certain amount of check-ins, is that happening? How is that happening? What's the result of it? Are these behaviors occurring more frequently, less frequently? Can we preempt them? So this is something that should be reviewed with the same team going forward. So usually it's a school psychologist, a social worker, whoever's in charge of special ed administration at the school. So that would be my answer. And yeah, you have the right to consistently monitor it.
I would also add that if you have a situation where like there's constant reports about your student and you're getting constant calls about incidences, I would ask to see the reports on those incidences. So even if it's not an incident that requires to be documented in the OR system, there's still an incident report that says what happened, especially if there was some type of injury or some type of damage to property. So you can ask, just, I would like to see the incident report. And also, if there are witnesses, there's always a witness statement. So they're going to redact, which means to remove the names, anything identifying of any witnesses if it's like another student. But you have the right to ask for the witness statements as well, and they'll redact those as well. So you can see what the story is and kind of get a picture of what's going on in the situation. And that may help you to identify something maybe your child can't express to you.
That's really helpful. Hold on, sorry. I'm just gonna put slideshow back up in a second. Sorry, I don't know.
No worries. So I just want to let everyone know of their rights. There's always documentation. So you have the right to that. You always have the right to any documents related to your students' academics or any incident happening within the school. So exercise your right so that you are fully informed when you're advocating for your student. And again, you can always call either parent center to get support should you feel that it's a little bit out of your realm or it's just becoming really complex. And that can happen particularly with behavior. So we have another question. Um, hmm. Tips for morning transition home to school and class to class. I'm not sure if that's the question. And then it says options with dealing with behaviors that impact education and learning. Um, who to make complaints to when you have a problem. About one-to-one requests for my nonverbal son, first year of high school. So I think it's like a cluster of questions.
Yeah.
So I'll stop and then we'll leave that last. Well, I know the last one's a comment. It says how to help my child express his emotions and say what he feels, if he feels bad, if something happened to him at school, if something hurt. So I think this is like support with the student and trying to like mitigate the areas in between.
Okay. So, I think,
And I have that question in the chat. I posted them there so you can see them listed out individually.
okay. Yeah. So, um, I think, transitioning from class to class, or from school to class, that's something again that you can work with the BIP, maybe with a safety plan in school, and discussing with the school the specific needs of your student. And if they need a para, for example, in unstructured time, um, again, uh, I'd say tips were with transition to school or transportation to school would be with the Office of Special Education or the Office of People Transportation and getting like a curb to school bus system set up. Um, who do you make complaints to when you have a problem about a one-to-one request for a nonverbal son first year in high school? I would say if the school hasn't been helpful, then the CSE, so that's the Committee on Special Education that oversees how special education services are implemented in the school. And you can find that by looking up your district. And if they're not super helpful, then you can reach out to the Office of Special Education and explain the situation. Um, there should be a path to escalation that you can follow. And we have, I know, I think both us and Synergia have trainings on this, specifically for due process and escalation. So if you have questions about that, you can go on either of our websites and find some documents there, or you can contact one of the parent centers. Um, as far as the last question, um, I would probably defer to Synergy on that one. I think in my role, I unfortunately don't uh, deal as much with like emotional support at home and how to support as a parent at home. So I don't know, Rima, do you have any thoughts on that?
So it really depends, right, first on the functionality of the student. So, is it a student that has difficulty communicating, or is it a student that is, right? So I believe we mentioned So I don't see the nonverbal. I want to say that all of these, if these three questions are from one person, then the student is non-speaking and the parent is asking how to help the child express their emotions. I'm assuming because they cannot speak. In that context, I would make sure that the student has counseling. If you are concerned that there is some type of emotional something's going on internally with the student that they can't express, I would absolutely first speak to the school. Um, you can start with at-risk counseling. I know that Ross mentioned that earlier. At-risk counseling, the great thing about it, it is short term, so it's going to be like 6 or 8 sessions at a time, which they can renew to extend. But the great thing is that that's like one paper, you sign it, and they can start the sessions. If you add it to an IEP, that's a lengthier process that takes more time for this support to actually begin. And you can do at risk while you're adding it to the IEP if that's something that the student will, benefit from for prolonged. Now, also, you want to speak to the teachers because if there's a non-speaking student, there should be some type of plan, right? There should be a speech therapist and there should be some type of communication plan for this student. There should be some speech goals. How does the student communicate in school? And this may look different for different students. So it could look like an emotion chart, and that looks differently, right? Like an emotion chart could have pictures of a happy face, a sad face, hungry, thirsty, sick, tired, right? Or it could look like a chart with words and colors, which may be known as zones of regulation. And you may see like green, yellow, blue, red, and it will help students to identify how they're feeling. And it buckets emotions into these different areas, these zones, so that they can identify that I feel in this blue zone or I feel in this green zone because I feel one of these emotions. So that's kind of how you teach all students, but particularly non-speaking students, how to connect with ideas that are more abstract, like emotions, right? And so, you want to put in place support at school or at home, counseling, or even any other kind of therapist. It may be if you have a speaking child that they could do some other type of therapy other than counseling. And then B is to make sure that you build something in place to teach the individual how to communicate and how to recognize emotions. Because if they don't recognize the emotions and they can't communicate, this may start to come out in the form of behaviors. And behaviors are usually a form of communication. Almost always, a behavior can be rooted back to something that the individual is trying to communicate, and they don't have the skills to do so. So I want to say that also your team needs to know your student, right? So when you see that maybe your team knows your student or maybe you do, your whole team needs to sit down and talk about the behaviors that your student exhibits, what happens before they have a negative behavior, what happens after. And that is really part of the FBA process. The functional behavior assessment is going to monitor certain behaviors and they're going to document these behaviors. And then they're going to say what happened before, what happened after, how long did this behavior last for, what seemed to cause the behavior, what support helped to de-escalate the behavior. And that's how the BIP, the behavior intervention plan, is developed. So these conversations need to be ongoing. They need to be part of the IEP, and there need to be regular check-ins to see how the student is doing. And this could be in the form of the parent training. Every IEP has, excuse me, parent counseling. So every student's IEP has parent counseling. It may say once a year, it may say once a month. It depends on the conversation you had with your school. But in that, you can use that parent counseling to have check-in time with your school to talk about these issues on an ongoing basis. But that's really how you handle this, is by continuing to monitor and have conversations and keep changing things until you see something to start work. And starting to work is data. You have to, the school has to say that this is improved, or you have to see that there's an improvement. And if not, you change the plan. I also wanted to say something about the options with dealing with behaviors that impact education and learning. Um, so your student is in school to learn, right? And so if they're not learning, the answer is not to change the setting. The answer is to implement structures and supports so that the student can learn. So I just want to remind everybody that you don't want to move a child to a more restrictive setting if they can learn in that class.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, even if there was conversation or a question before about the DOE forcing you into a program, again, it's not um I think to what Rima said, it's like yes, if they can learn, then they should be in the class. And the behavior is something that should be supported and addressed to help them learn rather than the placement necessary.
And also the FBA, um, it's 10 days of data. So they're gonna be looking at your child at different times for 10 days. So to the question about who has access to the VIP and what's the best way to address your child's discipline at school, that's a great way is to request the BIP because then they're going to have to document the data, they're going to have to observe it, and they're going to have to present this to you in a meeting in an official report that now has to go into the system where they have the IEPs. So informal conversations are great, but don't always lead to results. And so I think that's one of the big things here that we want parents to leave with and advocates. You have to document it. And that's what the BIP and the FBA does for families. Even if they do the data and it shows that the student doesn't need it, that's fine. Then the student doesn't need it. You didn't lose anything. But if the student needs it, you can lose. I had a case a while ago that a student that the school didn't do an FBA. The parent requested one, and they, instead of doing a behavior intervention plan, they told the parent that they were doing a behavior service plan, which doesn't exist. And so it's something that they informally did in a verbal agreement with the parent. And there are emails of the parent asking for the BIP. Months later, the student ends up in suspended. And at the hearing, I find out that there is no BIP, that they never did it. And the parent all this time has been thinking that the student has one. So the student had to plead no contest and accept the charges basically and be suspended. Whereas had they done the FBA and the BIP with fidelity, that student in an MDR in the hearing in the manifestation of disability review, that would have been, they would have gotten rid of it because it would have been result of disability. So I just want to tell parents, you really have to document, you have to read your IEP, make sure that everything that the team agreed to put in there is there and that your comments are there because that may save your child later and maintain their rights. If it's not documented, it's not real.
Yeah, and that's something that I've mentioned a few times before is that, an FBA goes into an IEP, which is a legal document, and the more documented it is, the more due process you have should it not be followed. So it makes it a lot easier to escalate or to get services if they're not given, because it is a legal document and the DOE has a legal obligation to provide those services and that support.
So I have a clarification from one of the questions earlier. It says, and I'm glad because I wanted to say something and I forgot, and she just reminded me. It says, hello, I'm clarifying that I'm using a translator. So that's the word, something got lost in translation. I'm the mother of an 18-year-old teenager with autism. My question is, if the student doesn't want to travel on the school bus and doesn't want to go to school either, and if that doesn't work with an FBA, could the possibility of virtual classes at home be considered? So it sounds a little bit like school avoidance and also not wanting to get on a bus. So my initial comment was that so not only curb to school busing, but travel training is an option to add as well in the first situation that we thought about. In this specific situation, I think it's a little bit different though. Like school avoidance is different. Um, so an FBA is not, so if it depends on the behavior, right? Because the FBA really is kind of specific to the classroom and to being in the school setting. Now, if there's a behavioral concern identified on the bus, the most that they could do is put in place a student transportation para where they could have somebody come to the home to get on the route with the student. And if there's a preferred adult in the building, a para that's available, that could work and that, this person can help them get on board with going. Another thing that an FBA could potentially do is to build a structure in place for when the student arrives at school that will make them want to get to school. And again, you mentioned 18-year-old, but 18-year-olds have different levels of function. I have an 18-year-old that functionally is probably at like a second grade level. And so if you could implement, for example, maybe a reward system, which may work, where you're giving tokens of rewards and they're putting them on some type of chart where they're getting this acknowledgement for doing this task and that the reward is enough. For older students that are, closer to grade level, that may not work because they may not care about like a token system. But then you may want to develop something where if they go to school, when they go to school, they're able to do this preferred activity, which doesn't interfere with academics, which you work out with the team at school. And so now you build into their schedule things that they look forward to in school so that they want to attend, and this is actually called PBIS. This is positive behavior intervention supports where you give students an incentive to do well or to go with the plan. So some schools have like bucks, right? They give you some type of like dollars and you're able to use this at like a school store or to get snacks. And that's just an example. Every school can have their own system, but that's something, and particularly high schools. There's an app called Kickboard. Some schools use that to give students points that they build up that they can use later. But these are all different tools that you can use to engage students' interests and use that to create a connection with school where then they want to be there. And again, it's very individual to your student, but these are some really general examples. Ross?
No, I mean, I think you hit the nail right on the head. And yeah, that speaks a little bit to also what an FBA can accomplish. It's not, one set of supports serves every student. It's really supposed to be tailored to the student and to their needs. So like, yeah, in the system, it sounds like, some sort of reward structure might be a really good tool. But another FBA that might not work as well. So, but it's, yeah, it's just important to know that it is a somewhat customizable document and that the DOE has options and also has resources and the experience of doing this. So it can be useful in that way.
Thank you. So I don't see any other questions at this time, which is great because we are right on time. So I want to thank everybody for being here today. Um, I want to thank our presenter from Advocates for Children, Ross. Thank you so much for providing us with all of this information. Um, it's really important and it's something that families don't often hear a lot about, but really do need a lot of support with when they end up in this situation. So thank you. We encourage our audience to please complete our surveys. We have our Synergia one in the chat, and you saw the QR code for AFC. We'll also send you links in the follow-up email along with the presentation. Somebody asked if this will be, the recording will be available. The recording is available now on Facebook, and it will be available on YouTube in the next few days. We truly appreciate your time. Again, please do our survey. And if anyone has any questions that you'd like to share with our presenter, you can let us know and I'll facilitate connecting you. But thank you again. We'll drop the survey one more time in the chat. But thank you for joining us and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.